Answer this before you defend yourself. When someone else seems to be purchasing the life you prayed for, do you still believe faithfulness is wise? The homes, the promotions, the weddings, the savings, the travel, the calm faces on the feed, and then your own disciplined choices, still producing no public proof. That is where the forbidden thought begins to form. Not loudly, more like a number written quietly in the margin. Obedience may be becoming a bad survival strategy, not jealousy, a calculation. This is not a sermon against noticing inequality. It is a warning against letting repeated exposure train your heart to call faithfulness foolish. Scripture has already recorded this pressure in Psalm 73. Asaph's danger was not that he saw prosperity. It was that he almost decided purity had been in vain. In vain. But before you call this envy, slow down. The Federal Reserve found that 37% of adults could not fully cover a $400 emergency with cash, or its equivalent. For context, that means one small emergency can turn patience into panic. It means rent, a repair, a wedding invitation, another person's house keys, can start feeling less like details and more like testimony. Pew found that 69% of Americans say young adults face more difficulty buying a home than their parents did. For context, your pressure is not imaginary. It has prices, deposits, paperwork, and time attached to it. So the heart opens a quiet courtroom ledger. Every visible milestone becomes a witness testifying against obedience, even though the judge has not spoken yet. The first danger is not seeing the gap. The first danger is letting the gap become a teacher, until the wound is no longer someone else's blessing, but the private suspicion that faithfulness may be costing you survival. The feed does not need to argue with your faith to reshape it. It only has to repeat the same lesson, quietly, while you are tired enough to believe it. You notice engagement photos while you are still budgeting alone. You read about a new kitchen while your emergency fund is thin. You hear about promotions while you keep choosing integrity in unseen places, where no one praises the restraint and no one knows what it cost you. At first, it feels neutral. Just checking. Just scrolling. Just trying to keep up with people you know. But repeated observation can become a slow drip measuring cup, where each milestone adds one more drop, until the soul starts calling the overflow truth. Now ask the harder question. What exactly are you learning while you watch? Social comparison research gives this pressure a name. In plain language, your heart does not simply notice another person's progress. It places that progress beside your own unfinished life and starts reading the gap as evidence. Cross and colleagues in 2013 found that Facebook use predicted declines in subjective well-being over time. Put simply, watching without context can make someone else's highlight feel like evidence against your own life. That is the quiet injury. Verdun and colleagues in 2015 found that passive Facebook use can erode emotional well-being through envy. In plain language, absorbing updates without the full weight of someone else's story can make their stability feel like a verdict on your delay. But do not make the mistake of blaming the device alone. The issue is not only the feed. The issue is the interpretation your heart starts to build after the same kind of exposure keeps landing on the same sore place. One drop for the ring, one drop for the kitchen, one drop for the promotion, one drop for the savings you do not have yet, one drop for the house keys resting in another person's hand. Then the cup spills over, and the overflow starts preaching. It says hidden faithfulness is inefficient. It says integrity is too expensive. It says delayed stability must mean you have been forgotten. That is how scrolling, hearing, and comparing can quietly form a theology of being left behind. And this is why stability can become a test for the observer, not only a blessing for the one receiving it. Psalm 73 does not open with a clean lesson about gratitude. It opens with a man whose footing is almost gone. Asaph says his feet had nearly slipped because he saw the prosperity and ease of the arrogant. The wound was not only that he had less. The wound was that their ease began to look like proof, and that proof began arguing against the life he had chosen before God. Then he names the thought careful believers usually bury. He had kept his heart clean in vain, for nothing. That is the ancient version of asking whether obedience has made you the foolish one. The mechanism is plain. His crisis is not lack alone, but the conclusion that purity has no payoff. Restraint begins to look unprofitable. Faithfulness begins to look like a poor survival calculation. And when Asaph enters the sanctuary, the text does not say his finances instantly change. What changes is the time horizon. Here is where the Bible becomes almost uncomfortable. It does not rush to make obedience look impressive. It sets sealed evidence on the table: a nearly empty jar, a handful of barley, a forgotten prison record, a treasure ledger Moses refused to sign. Not vague encouragement. Objects, places, time markers, reversals. In 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 8 through 16, the place is Zarephath. The condition is famine. The person is a widow. The evidence is a handful of flour in a jar, a little oil in a jug, and a final meal she expects to prepare before she and her son die. Elijah asks for bread from the place in her life that already feels exhausted. And then the jar of flour is not spent, and the jug of oil does not run dry. That is not glamorous provision. That is survival-level obedience. The point is not that her lack was imaginary. It was painfully physical. Flour in a jar, oil in a jug, a mother thinking about a final meal. The story begins where obedience feels like it is touching the last remaining margin, and God sustains her there before anything looks abundant. Then Ruth, chapter 2, places another evidence bag beside it. The place is the fields of Bethlehem. The people around her are reapers. The provision is leftover grain. Ruth works from morning until evening, and at the end of the day she brings home about an ephah of barley to Naomi. That is not instant stability. That is dust-covered providence. There is no quick public proof in that field. There is labor, leftover grain, and enough carried home by tired hands. Yet the record preserves the barley. It does not skip the ordinary part just because it lacks shine. It treats that gathered grain as evidence that God can begin sustaining a life long before that life looks secure to anyone else. Then Genesis 39 through 41 brings the third bag forward. The place begins in Potiphar's house. Joseph leaves his garment behind when he refuses sin. The next coordinate is prison. Then come 2 full years of forgetfulness. After that, he stands in Pharaoh's court, and the story moves toward grain storehouses through 7 years of abundance and 7 years of famine. That is not integrity paying quickly. That is integrity being buried before it is trusted. The garment looks like loss. The prison record looks like the punishment of a righteous choice. The 2 full years look like delay with no explanation. But later, the grain storehouses reveal that Joseph's hidden faithfulness was being prepared for a responsibility that compromise could never have carried. Stay with that. The Bible does not blush at the part where doing right seems to reduce visible advantage. It leaves the jar nearly empty. It leaves Ruth in the field. It leaves Joseph in prison for 2 full years. It lets the evidence sit long enough to offend every measurement system that only honors immediate stability. Then, Hebrews 11 verses 24 through 26 brings Moses to the same table. He refuses identification with Pharaoh's household. He refuses Egyptian treasure. He chooses reproach alongside the people of God instead of the visible advantage attached to the palace. There is a treasure ledger in front of him, and he will not sign it. That refusal matters, because it proves obedience cannot be reduced to short-term upward mobility. If immediate stability were the only measure, the widow would seem reckless, Ruth stuck, Joseph punished, and Moses irrational. Yet the record holds each story long enough for another kind of judgment to emerge. Not a denial of survival pressure or disregard for material needs, but a deeper assessment of what is truly secure. So when you see someone else's stability rise before you, it might be a blessing for them, but it can also serve as a test for you. Not a test of pretending the pain isn't real, but a test of whether visible advantage will become the measure of unseen faithfulness. The Bible never hides the economic folly of obedience. It preserves it long enough to reveal that the first calculation isn't the final truth. The scale must be broken, not your discipline or your concern, not the honest ache you feel for food, shelter, clothing, or emergency money. Those needs are real, and Scripture never asks you to pretend they are light when they weigh heavily. But this broken scale has been weighing houses, weddings, savings, and calm faces as if they equate to divine approval. It stacks someone else's visible stability on one side and your hidden faithfulness on the other, quietly deciding which life deserves blessing. That scale lies. So let's say plainly what is often left unspoken. In Matthew 6:25-34, Jesus mentions food, drink, clothing, and tomorrow. He doesn't shame the body for needing bread or treat clothing as vanity. He doesn't act as if the future holds no pressure. He brings these needs into the open, then places anxiety beneath the Father's care. Put simply, Jesus doesn't mock your need. He refuses to let your need become your master. That is the line. When need becomes master, it speaks with false authority. It tells you that delay means rejection, that stability means approval. It insists faithfulness only makes sense if God proves himself quickly, publicly, and according to your timetable. Then Luke 12:16-21 presses in harder. A man has barns full of stored goods and plans for ease. His life looks measurable, his future controlled, and his words calm. Yet the warning is sharp. Barns can become false proof. A full storehouse is not the same as a safe soul. That sentence deserves a pause because it breaks the whole calculation. Then 1 Timothy 6:6-10 sets the guardrail. Godliness with contentment is great gain, but craving riches pierces the soul with many griefs. Not because provision is evil or stability shameful, but because craving turns a good need into a master. So here's the reversal. Visible delay is not automatic rejection, and visible stability is not automatic approval. Your obedience is being protected from turning into a transaction where God must publicly prove every private sacrifice before you can keep trusting him. Your needs are real, but they must not become the voice of God. Before this ends, do not try to explain yourself. Place a sealed confession card beside the broken scale. Not a public speech. Not a promise that money will suddenly flow faster. Just a card with 4 numbers, quiet enough for honesty alone to touch. 1. Means I have been treating other stability as proof that God has forgotten me. 2. Means I have called impatience wisdom. 3. Means I have been tempted to trade obedience for visible speed. 4 means I need God to rebuild my system of measurement. Psalm 73 shows the turning point. The crisis didn't end when Asa stopped seeing prosperity. It changed when the sanctuary taught him to read the end, not just the surface. That is clear enough for a weary heart. The loudest evidence is not always the truest evidence. And 1 Timothy 6 still warns that craving riches can pierce the soul with many griefs. Not just one clean wound, but griefs that keep reopening. So choose carefully. No speech, no performance, just the number that tells the truth. Obedience is not foolish because it is unseen. It becomes foolish only when the soul forgets who is doing the measuring.